At number 10 is Jose Antonio Acosta Hernandez, aka El Diego. If evil is a measure of your body count, then Jose here tops the leaderboards. El Diego is the former leader of La Línea, the leading faction of the Juarez cartel. Originally established as a team of heavily armed ex and active duty police officers, this unit has evolved into the enforcement arm of the cartel, safeguarding narcotics traffickers from the criminal underworld. In 2012, Hernandez himself was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 20 years for his involvement in a litany of crimes, including racketeering, narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and of course the big M. And that M is big indeed, as Hernandez has confessed to orchestrating or partaking in over 1,500 unalivings between 2008 and 2012 alone. Hernandez finds himself serving not 1, not 2, but 3 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 20 years. His new permanent home is the ominous and supremely fortified confines of the ADX Florence Supermax facility, touted as the most secure correctional facility on the planet, even above maximum security prisons. Here, Hernandez resides in solitary confinement, as do all prisoners at ADX Florence, where he'll spend the rest of his days sitting with the consequences of his malevolent actions. If you're enjoying the video so far, you can support the channel by pressing the like button, subscribing to Most Amazing Top 10, and ringing that notification bell. Those who do can rest easy knowing that they're nowhere near as evil as number 9, Terry Nicholas. Terry Nicholas, American domestic terrorist, infamous for his role in 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. Born on April 1st, 1995, Nicholas had an array of short-term jobs from farming to real estate before a fateful encounter with Timothy McVeigh during a stint in the US Army. The alliance culminated in the tragic of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building on April 19, 1995, claiming 186 lives. In 1997, Nicholas was found guilty in a federal trial on charges including conspiracy to use weapon of mass destruction and involuntary man unaliving, which stemmed from the tragic demise of federal law enforcement personnel. Although the plaintiff sought the capital punishment, aka the unalive penalty, the jury couldn't reach a consensus, and so instead he served a life sentence without parole. He also faced state charges during yet another trial in Oklahoma, where he was convicted of a staggering 161 counts of first-degree unaliving, arson, and conspiracy, but yet again the state jury was unable to decide on whether to oppose capital punishment. As a result, he's serving 161 consecutive life sentences at ADX Florence in Colorado. On the other hand, his co-conspirator Timothy McVeigh, who planned and carried out the whole wasn't so lucky. McVeigh was executed in 2001. At number 8 is Luis Felipe, aka King Blood. Hailing from Havana, Cuba, Felipe made his way to the United States during the Mariel boat lift of 1990, an event famously depicted in Scarface. Among the so-called undesirables sent to the US was Luis Felipe, who would end up in Chicago, where he would first come into contact with the notorious Latin King street gang. Fast forward to 1986 and he moved to the Big Apple, where he founded the New York chapter of the Latin Kings. But eventually Luis Felipe was arrested on unaliving charges after he unalived his girlfriend while under the influence, serving 9 years at the Collins Correctional Facility in New York, but the tale only gets darker from here. See, in 95, he found himself convicted of orchestrating multiple unalivings from behind bars, penning the orders to fellow Latin kings on the outside. This led to his sentencing of life imprisonment, plus an additional 45 years served in strict solitary confinement with absolutely zero communication with the outside world. Currently, King Blood resides in the notorious ADX Florence. At number 7 is Caboni Savage, whose name isn't just fitting, it's an understatement. Emerging as a dealer in Hunting Park, Savage ascended to become a kingpin, orchestrating the distribution of vast quantities of nose powder throughout North Philadelphia from 98 to 04. Savage's malevolence escalated when he was accused of personally slaying a stranger. Notably, he even ordered hits on competitors and adversaries, including orchestrating the demise of a rival dealer, Carlton Brown. His ruthless grip extended to intimidation, with threats aimed at witnesses' families, but unfortunately those threats turned out to be promises. Enter Eugene Twin Coleman, once in cahoots with Savage, who testified against Savage in a narcotics trial, leading to Savage's conviction. Savage retaliated by orchestrating the arson of Marcella Coleman's house, and the bombing claimed 6 lives. Caboni Savage ended up receiving 13 consecutive unaliving sentences, while Lewis was only given a 40-year sentence on account of the stark differences on the level of remorsefulness displayed during their testimonies. At number 6 is Daria Nikolvania Saltykova, commonly known as Salty Chica. Born into a rich Russian noble family in the year 1730, Saltykova lived alone in her estate after the passing of her husband. You see, Saltykova had some serious connections in high places, rubbing elbows with the powerful elite, but eventually the persistence of victims' relatives relatives caught the attention of none other than Empress Catherine II. Saltykova was arrested and held for 6 years while authorities held a painstaking investigation which counted as many as 138 suspicious unalivings. After a public trial, Saltykova was found guilty of ending the lives of at least 38 female serfs through brutal beatings and torture. Eventually, she was sentenced to life imprisoned in Moscow, where she spent the first 11 out of 33 years chained in a basement dungeon without a window and only given a candle during meals. And number 5 is Robert Maudsley, aka Hannibal Lecter. The longest serving British prisoner in solitary confinement, had a troubled youth marked by violence claimed to father. In the 1960s, he turned to night walking due to substance addiction and sought psychiatric help after attempting self-harm, citing disturbing voices in his head which urged him to assassinate his parents. He said that if he had, he would have never committed any of his future unalivings. In 1974, he strangled John Farrell, who had shown Maudsley pictures of his kidnapped victims. He turned himself in, leading to his institutionalization at Broadmoor Hospital. In 1977, Maudsley and another inmate brutally tortured and eliminated another inmate, resulting in another conviction and transferred to Wakefield Prison, where he brutally attacked and offed 2 fellow inmates, displaying extreme violence and earning him the nickname Hannibal the Anthropophage, because that's better somehow. Deemed far too dangerous, Maudsley occupies a 2-cell basement unit and is always escorted by 4 officers outside of his cell. At number 4 is James Marcello, aka Little Jimmy, aka Jimmy Light, aka Jimmy the Man. In April 2005, the spotlight shone on front boss of the Chicago outfit and his half-brother Michael Mickey Marcello as they face charges for racketeering, conspiracy, loan sharking, running illegal gambling schemes, and 18 separate counts of unaliving people. Marcello's bid for freedom saw him offering a staggering $12.5 million worth of homes and bond collateral, a desperate attempt thwarted by the US District Judge. The former boss is now serving a life sentence in solitary at, you guessed it, the ADX Florida Supermax facility. Speaking of which, number 3 is Thomas Silverstein, America's most isolated man. This dude just can't seem to stop offing people. Thomas Silverstein's life in prison began at 19 for armed robbery, and he was sent to San Quentin. After some more crimes, he landed in Leavenworth, Kansas with a 15-year sentence. And in 1980, he earned a life sentence for eliminating an inmate who wouldn't be a pawn in his substance distribution scheme. He moved to USP Marion, enduring extreme solitary confinement, but nevertheless, he was accused of another murder in 81 and got another life sentence, leading to his feud with rival gang member Raymond Lee Cadillac Smith, who he also eventually assassinated as the guards did nothing to keep the two apart. Then, after that, he orchestrated a guard's assassination and faced more life sentences. The guard's assassination served as the final straw, leading to a 23-year lockdown at the prison and inspiring a whole new prison design. Silverstein spent 36 years in solitary there, passing away as the longest held prisoner in the Bureau of Prisons. Dzhokhar Tartsev, who, along with his brother Tamerlan, orchestrated the infamous and devastating Boston Marathon. The brothers placed pressure cooker near the finish line, causing 3 people to lose their lives and astounding 281 others to be injured in the aftermath. Just 3 days later, after their faces were revealed to the public thanks to CCTV footage, they fatally assassinated MIT police officer Sean Collier, not because they were identified, but because they wanted to steal his firearm. Then they hijacked an SUV and engaged in a wild with the police, even throwing at them. As Dzhokhar was trying to escape law enforcement, he drove over his own brother, dragging him under the stolen SUV about 30 feet. His brother didn't survive, and Dzhokhar abandoned the SUV and vanished on foot into the night, triggering an unprecedented manhunt of epic proportions. He was eventually discovered hiding in a boat in a Watertown backyard not far from where he had ditched the SUV. Inside the boat, scribbled on the cabin wall with a pen, the bomber left a note claiming the responsibility for the marathon attack, citing vengeance for US military actions in Afghanistan and Iraq. It coldly referred to the innocent victims as collateral damage, drawing eerie parallels to the casualties of war. He even expressed complete lack of remorse for having unalived his own brother. Ultimately, justice caught up with Tartsev. He faced trial where he's convicted of a staggering 30 counts, and his fate was sealed with a sentence of capital punishment. At number 1 is Clara Homolka, who gets the top spot for being Canadian. Sure doesn't make me proud. Back in the late 1990s, Clara Homolka and her partner in crime, Paul Bernardo, engaged in some truly heinous acts, responsible for the demise of not 1, not 2, but 3 innocent women, one of whom happened to be Clara's own sister, Tammy. Now, once her co-conspirator got nabbed by the authorities in '83, Clara decided to switch gears and claim that she was actually dragged into this nightmare against her will, painting herself as the unwilling accomplice. She then struck a deal that landed her a relatively lenient sentence of 12 years, and all she had to do was spill the beans on Paul. Jump back to the year 2007, and guess who's back on the streets? That's right, you guys, she didn't need to escape prison because, well, they let her out onto the streets willy-nilly. That's right, Homolka, now a mom of 2 and remarried, and get this, she's volunteering at a school in Montreal. Parents everywhere were like, hold up, are we seriously gonna let a former serial unaliver be around our miniature clones? Well, that was quite the unsettling journey through the lives of those who find themselves eternally secluded from the outside world.
Number 10. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was a prostitute who ended the lives of many men in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot dead and robbed 7 of her male clients. She claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all of the deaths were committed in self-defense. Aileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. She had no remorse for these men and said, "I want the world to know I killed these men as cold as ice. I've hated humans for a long time. I am a serial killer." This really shows how she had no remorse for her actions and that she didn't really commit these crimes as self-defense. Number 9. Albert Fish. Albert Fish ended the lives of many of the young and was suspected in at least 5 homicides. He was nicknamed the Boogeyman for his predatory behavior. He confessed to 3 deaths that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Albert once boasted his number of victims was about 100. He abducted Grace Budd in 1928, and in an abandoned home in Winchester County, New York, he ended her life and devoured her body. He wrote a letter to Grace's mother telling her about the crimes he committed against her daughter. He said, "When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it, and eat it." Now this is truly disturbing, and I can't imagine how the mother felt receiving that letter. Number 8. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929 in the city of Dusseldorf. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife. This made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the blood dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day, Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf. She reported him to the police and he was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of homicide and 7 of attempted homicide. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of the charges, but he was found guilty of everything and sentenced to death. Peter displayed no emotion as the sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded. Now this isn't a confession, but more of a question, but it is so gross. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Wow, that is just disgusting. Number 7. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy kidnapped, took advantage of, and ended the lives of dozens of young women during the 1970s and possibly earlier. Ted often employed his charm to disguise his intentions when kidnapping victims and extended this tactic to law enforcement, the media, and the criminal justice system to maintain his claims of innocence. He typically approached women in public places, either asking for help by faking an injury or impersonating an authority figure. Once tricked into being led away, they would then be bludgeoned unconscious and taken elsewhere to be taken advantage of and eventually die. In 1975, he was arrested and jailed in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in several states. The day before his execution, he told Dr. James Dobson, "Serial killers do not stand out in a crowd, and if gone unnoticed, look just like the average person. As we serial killers are your sons, we are your husbands, and we grew up in regular families. families, which is just chilling. Then while in prison after more than a decade of denials, Ted also confessed to ending the lives of more than 30 people committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978, but experts estimate the real number could exceed 100. Number 6. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was truly an evil man. He committed so many crimes, most of them the unthinkable. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, Carl confessed to having committed the deaths of 21 boys and men, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He is suspected of having ended the lives of more than 100 boys and men in the United States alone. He also confessed to have committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage of males of all ages. He wrote, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all those things, I am not the least bit sorry. I have no conscience, so that does not worry me. I hate the whole damn human race, including myself." Number 5. Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper ended the lives of 10 people. These included his own mother and her best friend, his grandparents, and female college students hitchhiking in the vicinity of Santa Cruz County, California. He targeted the young female hitchhikers during his spree by luring them into his vehicle and driving them to secluded areas where he would end their lives before taking their corpses back to his home to be decapitated, dismembered, and violated. While speaking with Front Page Detective magazine, Edmund explained his thought process when finding his victims, saying, "One side of me says, I'd like to talk to her, date her. The other side of me says, I wonder what her head would look like on a stick." He also said, "The first time I had sex with a dead body, it makes you sick to your stomach." Number 4. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer ended the lives of many young men in Milwaukee where he would then dismember them. It had been reported that he ended the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in Jeffrey's bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray at the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle. In his freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in his apartment, the investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male sex organs, a mummified scalp, and in a 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of his victims were also found. He was convicted of 16 counts of ending someone's life, and he was to serve 16 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Now, while in jail, he talked about eating people and famously said, "I ate someone with a tattoo once. The ink made the meat taste like shh. Eat garlic to avoid vampires, get tattoos to avoid cannibals." So, there you have it. Tattoos can save you from those who eat other humans. Number 3. Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton ended the lives and took advantage of many as a former pig farmer who is suspected of being one of the most prolific criminals in Canadian history. After dropping out of school, Robert left a butcher's apprenticeship to begin working full-time at his family's pig farm. He is believed to have begun ending people's lives in the early 1980s after inheriting the farm. Arrested in 2002, he was convicted in 2007 of the second-degree homicide of 6 women and was also the subject of a lengthy investigation that yielded evidence of numerous other deaths. Robert was charged with the deaths of an additional 20 women, many of them from Vancouver's downtown east side. During the trial's first day of jury evidence, the Crown stated that Robert had confessed to 49 deaths to an undercover agent from the Office of Inspector General who was posing as a cellmate. The Crown reported that Robert told the officer he wanted to end the life of another woman to make an even 50 and that he was caught because he was sloppy, which is just chilling. Number 2. Joe Metheny. Joe Metheny ended the lives and took advantage of many people in the Baltimore, Maryland area. While he had claimed to end the lives of 13 people, sufficient evidence was only found to convict him of 2 homicides. Research later confirmed 3 more victims, though he had not been charged with them. According to Joe, after spending time with his victims, he felt himself compelled to strangle the women. He claimed that he used his victims' bodies to create ground beef, which he then sold at barbecues, which literally makes me want to throw up. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences for the deaths and served nearly 2 decades before dying behind bars in 2017. Now, a scary comment from him showed him how evil he really was, as he said, "The words I'm sorry will never come out, for they would be a lie." It is so crazy to me that someone could do those horrific things and feel nothing about the matter. And coming in at number 1 is Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a criminal who created a cult called the Manson family. It was active in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The group consisted of approximately 100 followers who lived an unconventional lifestyle and frequently used psychoactive substances. Now, the members of the cult believed that he was Jesus Christ and followed everything he said. Now, some of the members committed a series of 9 deaths at 4 locations in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide for the deaths of 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the deaths, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. Now, he has been clear that he has no remorse, as he once said. Remorse for what? You people have done everything in the world to me, doesn't that give me equal right? I can do anything I want to you people at any time I want to because that's what you've done to me. Maybe I should have slain 400 or 500 people, then I would have felt better. Then I would have felt that I really offered society something. You've got it stuck in your brain that I slayed somebody. What do you want to call me a slayer for? I've never slain anyone. I don't need to. I think it. I have it here.
Starting us off at number 10 is John Justin Bunting. Known as the ringleader for the infamous Snowtown killings, Bunting is responsible for the death of 11 people in South Australia between 1992 and 1999. John Justin Bunting was a troubled man known to have an intense hatred for homosexuals as well as people interested in minors. And while I think we can all agree that it's understandable he hated those interested in minors, the problem is that he never had any proof that his victims were criminals of such things and would just assume they were because they were also gay. Most of his victims were either friends, roommates, or relatives, and along with his 3 other conspirators, he would kidnap the victims, then torture them in various sick ways before taking their lives. The case was uncovered when the remains of 8 people were found in barrels of acid in Snowtown, Australia. Then 3 days later, 2 more victims were found buried in a backyard. Allegedly, their final victim was fried and eaten by Bunting and his gang. After a series of trials, Bunting was ultimately declared the ringleader and was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. The others face similar charges, each serving 1 life sentence per charge, and these monsters will thankfully be locked up until their last days. Next up at number 9, Andre Thomas. Early on in life, Andre was unfortunately very badly abused by his mother and began to experience crushing auditory hallucinations at the age of 10. Then in 1999, while in grade 9, he met Laura, who soon became pregnant and brought Andre Jr. into the world later that year. Now with a son, Andre decided to drop out of high school and get a job to support his family, and by the age of 18, he and Laura finally married. The marriage, however, was short-lived, as Laura quickly caught on to the realities of his mental health issues and separated from Andre 4 months later. Tragically, however, the separation took a devastating toll on Andre's not yet diagnosed condition, which began convincing him that Laura was Jezebel and Andre Jr. was the Antichrist, and that he had to kill them. Finally, in March of 2004, Andre broke into her apartment and killed the entire family, each with a separate blade, as he claimed he did not want to contaminate their blood and allow the demons inside of them to live. After the incident, he attempted to take his own life. However, when that didn't go to plan, he removed one of his eyes instead. Eventually, after a long trial, he was sentenced to death for his crimes until 3 years later when he removed his remaining eye and ingested it. While his sentence did not change officially, this incident catapulted Andre to be relocated to a psych ward, as he was eventually seen as not not adequately fit to be executed. Coming in at number 8, the Icebox Killer. On June 2nd, 1991, 23-year-old Denise attended a concert in LA and began making her way home to Orange County around 2 a.m. However, the next morning when her parents, who she lived with, woke to find she wasn't there, they called police to make sure she hadn't been in an accident or hurt somehow. But all that was found was Denise's car on the side of a freeway with a drained battery. And for 3 years, no one had any clue where she was. That was until July of 1994 when a woman arrived at the house of a man named John Femerello to purchase some paint. While there, she saw what appeared to be a very old rental car in her driveway, and after getting a strange feeling about him, she reached out to authorities who determined the car was stolen. Still not connecting the two incidents, a police officer arrived on site to speak to John about the stolen vehicle. But when he arrived, he noticed an electrical cord running to a freezer from the back of the truck. Initially believing he was running some kind of lab, the deputy reached out to a locksmith to open the back of the truck. But to his horror, the body of a young, beaten, and tortured woman was inside, who was later determined to be the missing woman, Denise Huber. And tragically, after investigating the property, it became evident she had likely not been his only victim. John was convicted and sentenced to death in 1997 and remains locked up in California awaiting his fate. Coming in at number 7, the Pig Farmer Killer. Robert William Picton, or Willie, is a Canadian pig farmer responsible for killing 49 women between 1982 to 2002. Willie was known to be a fairly quiet and simple guy by his friends and family, and after his parents' death took over the family farm in 1980. But once he was in charge of the farm, he would soon become a monster. While it's not known exactly the detail of each crime, it's believed he would engage with escorts and then in the middle of, well, you know, would get extremely angry and blame them for thefts or crimes. The situation would escalate and he would ultimately handcuff the victims before attacking them and take their lives. But the creepiest part is that from there, he would take the bodies of his victims and put them through a wood chipper before feeding it to his pigs. And it's believed that some of the resulting bits would get mixed in with pork mince and sold to friends and family. Upon his 2002 arrest for his crimes, Willie admitted to all accounts and was even disappointed as he was trying to round out his tally to an even 50 prior to being caught. Willie was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for at least 25 years, although it seems highly unlikely they are ever going to let him leave. Coming in at number 6, Randy Stephen Kraft. Between 1972 to 1983, Randy Stephen Kraft became known as the Scorecard Killer after being found responsible for the death of 16 young men in California. However, although only convicted of 16 victims, it's believed he harmed, tortured, and killed up to 67 men in the area. After high school graduation in 1963, Randy's plan was to become a US Senator, and so he enrolled in college for economics. However, through his college years, he began to distance himself from his previous dreams and started drinking, partying, and getting himself into trouble. After just barely graduating, Randy joined the US Air Force and rose to Airman First Class. However, by 1969, he was discharged after the Army discovered he was gay. Around this same time, Kraft became distant from his family as they did not really approve of his sexuality either, and by 1970, he committed his first known essay on a boy. The following years, Kraft became obsessed and would lure young men, often of military background, to his van, then and take advantage of them before torturing their bodies until death and dumping them along the nearest freeway. This pattern repeated for over 10 years until he was finally caught and sentenced to death, where he now remains locked up awaiting his inevitable fate. Next up at number 5, BTK. To the public and his community, he was a totally normal, polite, and well-mannered man. Rader was an active member of his church and was actually elected president of the church council and even volunteered as a Cub Scout leader. He had a wife and kids who would describe him as a totally average and nice guy. But Rader had a dark secret that would soon change everything. Despite his outward persona, he was actually a truly disturbed man and was into some pretty terrifying things in the bedroom that eventually leaked their way into his crimes. To start off, I'll give you a hint. BTK is an abbreviation that stands for bind, torture, kill. And it was disturbing things along those lines that he liked to do to, as he put it, trapped and helpless women. But if a woman wasn't available, he would take pictures of himself in women's clothing wearing a mask of a woman's face and bind himself, as he seemed to enjoy living out a fantasy as his own victims. Between 1974 to 1991, Dennis Rader killed 10 women in Wichita, Kansas, and was known to send taunting letters to the authorities and media describing his crimes in gruesome detail. There was then a strange hiatus in his crimes for about 10 years, but thankfully this creep was arrested in 2005 and is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences, one for each woman he killed. Coming in at number 4, George Emil Banks. Despite having a previous criminal record for an armed offense, Banks managed to get a job as a correctional officer in 1980. However, in 1982, Banks began worrying coworkers after he kept saying things like a race war would soon consume the world, and that he wanted to protect his sons and daughters from the torment and agony of racism. Then, after a conflict with a supervisor, he was put on extended leave from the prison and ordered to be examined for mental health issues. Not long after his mandated leave from work, Banks, having consumed massive amounts of drugs and alcohol, tragically killed 13 people, 9 of which were his own family members, 3 former in-laws, and 1 bystander. Unbeknownst to Banks, his former brother-in-law was able to survive by hiding in the closet and called police to identify the attacker as Banks. Eventually, police were able to track him down at a friend's house, and after a 4-hour standoff, they were able to draw him out. During the trial, Banks explained his crimes by saying he did not want his offspring to be victimized in a race war, as he had suffered from racism much of his life as a biracial man. This explanation, however, did not sway the jury, and he was convicted to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Coming in at number 3, Joseph Fritzl. One of the most heartbreaking cases I have ever read about is the case of Joseph Fritzl. Born in 1935 in Austria, at 21 he married a girl named Rosemary, and the pair had a family of 7 together. Now, he was a very abusive man to everyone in his family, but especially Elizabeth. However, the peak of his cruelty began when Elizabeth was 18 and he lured her into the basement, where he trapped her for the next 24 years. In those 24 years, he assaulted her constantly, and during her imprisonment, she gave birth to 7 people. Of course, over the years, many were concerned about Elizabeth's disappearance, but Fritzl would lie and say that she ran off to join a cult, and that he had no clue where she was. One day, after one of Elizabeth's offspring was ill, she managed to convince him to take her to the hospital, and once they arrived, police were on site to detain them. After making sure she would never be forced to see her father again, Elizabeth told authorities everything that her father ever did to her and her little ones, and Fritzl was sentenced to life for his crimes. Coming in at number 2, Gary Ridgway. Gary grew up in a troubled household with very little stability, which led to him wetting the bed well into his teen years. However, after each incident, his mother would clean him up, leading Gary to have conflicting feelings of both anger and desire towards his mother, often fantasizing about killing her and doing unspeakable things to her corpse. When he got older, he joined the military, and it was during his time in combat that he became obsessed with escorts. Once he returned back to America, his first marriage ended quickly after his wife discovered he had given her multiple infections. Soon after, he married again, this time finding salvation in the church. He forced his wife into a staunch and devout life, but in contrast, kept his ravenous appetite for inappropriate relations with those whose company he paid for. But Ridgway had an inner conflict about his desires, and so he started strangling the women after he he had got what he wanted from them, dumping their brutalized bodies into the woods. Disgustingly, it was later revealed by one of his wives that he would often ask to have relations in the woods. At the time, she didn't know why, but during investigations, multiple of his victims were found buried in those woods, and authorities believe he got pleasure from being in the area. Upon his arrest, he was officially convicted for taking 49 lives, but during trial, he famously said he had killed so many that he lost count and that he didn't even know the real number anymore. Last up in our number 1 spot, Edmund Kemper. One of the most notorious killers of the 20th century, early on Kemper showed signs of strange behavior. It started out with torturing insects, but by age 10 he buried his pet cat alive, waited for it to die, then dug it up, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a spike. From there, things only got more concerning. By the age of 13, his parents divorced and his mother became his sole parental figure. However, she was an abusive alcoholic who mocked and humiliated the boy, and so their relationship turned into an extremely toxic one. At 14, Kemper ran away from home to try and be with his father, but eventually ended up living with his grandparents, and that is where things got really bad. At age 15, he killed both his grandparents and was arrested for the crimes. However, due to his age, he didn't face any criminal charges. By 1969, on his 21st birthday, he was released on parole against his psychologist's warning and sent to live with his mother. Kemper, however, hated his mother, and the two fought non-stop. By 1972, he began seeking out college student victims after a fight with his mother, and by 1973, he had taken the lives of 8 different women this way, becoming known in the public as the co-ed killer. Finally, in April of 1973, he bludgeoned his mother in her sleep before doing awful, unspeakable things to her decapitated head, and then called over her best friend and killed her too before turning himself in. In the end, Kemper was sentenced to life in prison despite his request to be tortured to death, and will remain behind bars until his final day.
Number 10. Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin. Alcatraz, the famous island prison a little over a mile off the coast of San Francisco, held prisoners including gangsters Al Capone and George Machine Gun Kelly. Among its other famous inmates were brothers John and Clarence Anglin and Frank Morris, who executed an elaborate escape plan. On June 11th, 1962, they pulled off one of the greatest prison escapes in American history. After months of planning, they used 3 papier-mâché heads that made them appear to be sleeping as they squeezed through air vents and made their way to the Pacific Ocean, where they boarded a raft they'd made out of stolen raincoats. They were never seen again, and because their raft and paddles washed up ashore, many believe the men drowned in the icy waters. The Anglin family insists the brothers survived and have presented evidence to prove it, and the US Marshal Service has kept the case open in the unlikely event the trio is still alive, according to the FBI. So, did they really escape? No one knows except them. Number 9. Victor Fuerga. On February 6, 1997, Victor Fuerga, a convict serving 1 to 4 years for possession, was supposed to be on the way to the mess hall when he wandered off from the Moria Shock Incarceration Facility, a minimum security prison in Mineville, New York. It was during a routine phone call with his sister, Yvette Cruz, a few days before his alleged escape that he voiced unrest with his conditions, complaining about a particular guard, and an overall feeling of angst. "There's a guard who keeps messing with me. Look, I have to let you go," Victor shared with his sister before disappearing entirely a few days later. She replied, "Poppy, you know I love you. This is going to end in a few months. Please call me tomorrow." But he never did. As soon as his absence was noted, authorities scoured the area, searchers examined the surrounding area, and found footprints leading to a nearby abandoned mine shaft. They assumed that Victor had fled to the mine to avoid detection and fallen to his death. Further pursuit was halted as conditions in the mine were too dangerous for a thorough search to be performed. All anyone knows for sure is that Victor was never seen or heard from again, and he's the only New York State prison inmate to escape and never been found. Number 8. Jerry Bergvin. Records in his thick prison file show that Jerry Bergen's brushes with the law began in the 1940s. In 1962, he was arrested for breaking into a Flint store, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 10 to 15 years behind bars on multiple accounts for that burglary and others. Jerry later appealed on a technicality, had trial, and got a reduced sentence. He then wrote letters begging to be transferred from the state prison in Jackson to Camp Waterloo so he could attend dental technician training program there. Wary prison officials expressed concerns about his misconduct in prison, but in April 1969 they agreed to the transfer. The camp housed low-level offenders, and one day he just escaped. Authorities think he may have scaled the barbed wire fence, but it was so long ago that the Michigan Department of Corrections can't say for sure. In 2013, Department of Corrections decided to call off the search for Jerry, who would have been 80 years old at the time, and he's never been found. Number 7. Glenn Stark Chambers. Connie Weeks was a 21-year-old waitress who was the mother of a toddler son at the time she was dating Glenn. On the morning of January 22nd, 1975, the couple had an argument that later spiraled into a physical confrontation. Glenn waited for her outside of her work and assaulted her in the parking lot. An off-duty officer intervened and he was arrested. She bailed him out, and later that day, he showed up at the hospital carrying her in his arms. She had severe brain trauma and there was blood found throughout the apartment and in Glenn's vehicle. After 5 days, she was pronounced dead on January 27th. Glenn was convicted of first-degree murder on May 29th, 1975, and on July 11th, he was sentenced to death in the electric chair. On February 21st, 1990, while making office furniture at Florida's Polk Correctional Facility, he convinced other inmates to box him inside a crate and load the crate onto a truck. Somewhere between Polk City and Daytona Beach, Glenn escaped from the back of the truck. When the vehicle did arrive at its destination, his discarded inmate clothing was discovered. Described as intelligent and resourceful, Glenn has family in Minnesota and Florida, and people have reported seeing him in Florida and Alabama, but he is still out there today. Number 6. Glenn Stewart Goodwin. In 1980, Glenn Stewart Goodwin was living in Palm Springs, California, and him and his roommate planned to rob a dealer and pilot Kim Robert LaValle, who was once a friend of theirs. They lured Kim back to their condominium where Glenn punched and kicked him, tried to strangle him, then ultimately stabbed Kim 26 times. After the death, the roommates loaded the body onto a truck and set off for the desert. Glenn tried to blow up the evidence by using homemade explosives strapped to the body. On August 3rd, 1980, some Eagle Mountain residents found a blown-up pickup truck with remains of a human body inside of it abandoned in the desert. Later, police identified the body and charged Glenn with first-degree murder. He was sentenced for the death and robbery to 26 years to life in prison in 1983. In 1987, Glenn escaped the Folsom State Prison in California. He cut a hole through a fence wire and escaped into a storm drain that emptied into the American River. He dropped through a manhole and crawled 750 feet to a raft that he used to float down the river, following painted arrows on rocks that directed him where to go. Later that year, he was arrested for trafficking in Mexico and sent to prison in Guadalajara. In 1991, he allegedly ended the life of a fellow inmate and escaped yet again. He goes by a number of aliases and is believed to be somewhere in Central or South America as of right now, and the FBI is offering a $20,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. Number 5. Omid Nino Tavini. Omid Nino Tavini was a kingpin of an organized crime family in Canada, which is connected to various international crime organizations. From 1999 to 2002, he ran a fraudulent telemarketing business that targeted people in the United States, stealing approximately US $3 million from hundreds of victims, most of them the elderly. By 2003, the RCMP recognized Nino as heading up one of the main criminal organizations operating out of an Iranian community in Canada. He was arrested, and in 2007, while in custody, Nino walked out of a maximum security prison in Canada's British Columbia wearing a janitor's uniform. He had the assistance of a guard whom he bribed to look the other way. The guard, whom Nino never paid, was prosecuted, but Nino remains an international fugitive. He's also wanted in the United States in connection with his fraudulent telemarketing business. In 2017, Nino, who is now almost 40, may have called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to negotiate his return to custody in exchange for a promise to not to extradite him to the United States, but authorities have doubt that the call was credible. Number 4. 4. Vasilis Plalakosis. Vasilis Plalakosis is a Greek bank robber and fugitive known as the Greek Robin Hood for his habit of giving away stolen money to the poor. He twice escaped by helicopter from a Greek high-security prison while serving a 25-year sentence. He is still free, earning him the nickname of the Uncatchable. While serving a 25-year sentence for kidnapping and robbery, Vasilis managed to escape by helicopter once in 2006 and once in 2009. He hasn't been seen since the 2009 escape, in which he and his cellmate climbed up a rope ladder thrown to them from a helicopter flying over the prison yard. It seems that the helicopter had apparently been hijacked by a woman, and the cellmate was caught, but Vasilis remains at large. The government of Greece faced intense criticism after his second escape from the same facility, and the government responded by firing 3 Justice Ministry officials and arresting 3 prison guards. Vasilis is still at large with a €1 million bounty placed on him for information leading to his arrest, and he could be anywhere in the world. Number 3. George Edward Wright. On Friday, November 23, 1962, the day after Thanksgiving, George Wright and 3 accomplices were involved in the commission of multiple armed robberies. The 4 suspects first robbed the Sands Motel of $200. They then made their way to a gas station, and during the second robbery, they fatally wounded Walter Patterson, a 42-year-old World War II veteran and Bronze Star recipient. Walter later passed away. George was arrested and subsequently sentenced to 15 to 30 years in prison. On August 22, 1970, George first escaped from a New Jersey prison. He was caught and put back into prison only to escape again in 1972. And then he came up with a plan to avoid being re-imprisoned. On July 31, 1972, George and accomplices hijacked a Delta airplane. After collecting ransom and releasing the passengers, George and his crew flew the plane to Algiers. In 2011, the police caught up with him in Portugal, but since Portugal has no extradition treaty with the United States, he was released and remains at large. Number 2. Joanne Deborah Trissimard. Joanne Deborah Trissimard is an American political activist who was a member of the Black Libertarian Army. In 1977, she was convicted in the first-degree murder of State Trooper Werner Forrester during a shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike in 1973. She was sentenced to life in prison, and on November 2, 1979, she escaped with the help of a revolutionary group that she was a member of. She escaped the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey when 3 members of the Black Liberation Army visiting her drew concealed weapons and a stick of dynamite, seized 2 correction officers as hostages, commandeered a van, and made their escape. No one was injured during the prison break, including the officers held hostage who were left in a parking lot. According to later court testimony, she lived in Pittsburgh until August 1980 when she flew to the Bahamas. The FBI continues to offer a $1 million reward for information leading to catching Joanne. She has been living in Cuba, where she was granted political asylum in 1984. And coming in at number 1 is Sharon Kin. Sharon Kin ended the lives of 3 people in the 1960s. The first was her own husband, James Kin, the second, Patricia Jones, the wife of a man whom Sharon was having an affair, and the third was a Mexican-born American citizen whose life was taken in Mexico. She was serving 13 years in a Mexican prison when she escaped on December 7, 1969. She wasn't present for a routine 5 p.m. roll call, and her absence was not officially noted until she also failed to show up at a second roll call later that evening. A manhunt was then arranged, initially focusing on northern Mexican states due to authorities' belief that Sharon may have been heading for the last known whereabouts of a former inmate whom she had grown close to while they were in prison together. The search also encompassed countrywide transport hubs and eventually circled back to the Mexico City area. U.S. authorities, including the FBI, were also alerted of the Mexican authorities' beliefs that Sharon may have attempted to work her way back into her native country. As of 2022, she is the subject of the longest currently outstanding arrest warrant for murder in the history of Kansas City, Missouri, and one of the longest outstanding felony warrants in U.S. history. Number 10. Maxim Petrov. Maxim Petrov was convicted for the ending of 11 people's lives in St. Petersburg between 1999 and 2000. Maxim, nicknamed Dr. Death by the Russian media, was a practicing doctor who targeted patients from a local health center, ending their lives by giving them lethal injections at their homes, then robbing them. All victims were included on the same list of lung patients who had undergone fluorography. Using this list, the police identified 72 possible future victims in an operation called Medbrat, male nurse, involving 700 police officers. They arrested Maxim when he visited one of the patients on January 17th in the year 2000. On his arrest, Maxim admitted admitted to the deaths but recanted his confession a few months later, blaming it on the intense psychological pressure he had endured while in custody. Various possessions stolen from the victims were later found in his flat, though he had already sold others at the market. He was suspected of ending the lives of 19 people but tried for just 17. In 2002, Maxime was found guilty of 11 and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Number 9. Luca Magnotta. The name Luca Magnotta may sound familiar to some. Have you ever seen the Netflix documentary Don't F with Cats? Because if you have, this is where he's from. Luca took the life of John Lin, a university student in Montreal, Canada, in May 2012. After Luca ended his life, he then began to mail one's body parts to schools and federal political party offices. Then a video depicting the crime was posted online and Luca fled Canada, becoming the subject of an Interpol red notice and prompting an international manhunt. In June 2012, he was arrested in an internet cafe in Berlin where he was caught Googling himself. He also was previously sought out by animal rights groups for uploading videos of himself ending the lives of kittens. In December 2014, after 8 days of deliberations, a jury convicted him of his crime and was given a mandatory life sentence and 19 years for other charges to be served concurrently. He is currently at Port Cartier prison in Quebec. Number 8. Rosemary West. Rosemary West collaborated with her husband Fred West in the torture and the ending of lives of at least 9 women between 1973 and 1987. Rosemary also ended the life of her stepdaughter Charmaine in 1971. After police found human remains and apparent signs of torture at 25 Cromwell Street, Rose, along with Fred, were arrested in February 1994. During her trial, Rose denied ending the lives of any of the victims. Rose told the jury that her husband committed the criminal acts alone and she denied participating. In 1995, Rose was sentenced to life in prison while her husband ended his life before going to trial. She was found guilty of all 10 counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment, and it was emphasized that she should never be paroled. The Lord Chief Justice later decided that she should spend at least 25 years in prison, but in July 1997, Home Secretary Jack Straw subjected Rose to live out the rest of her life in jail. She's currently being held at HM Prison, Newhall in West Yorkshire. Number 7. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, aka BTK, an abbreviation he gave himself for bind, torture, and kill, ended the lives of 10 people between the years of 1974 and 1991 in Wichita and Park City, Kansas. He didn't just end lives, but also stalked women, and 2 women he stalked in the 1980s and one whom he stopped in the mid-1990s filed restraining orders against him. He also sent taunting letters to police and media outlets describing the details of his crimes. By 2004, the investigation of BTK was considered a cold case. Then, after a decade-long hiatus, Dennis initiated a series of 11 communications to the local media. This activity led directly to his arrest in February 2005. He pled guilty and was sentenced in 2005 to 10 life sentences, and though he's eligible for parole, it won't be until he's served at least 175 years. He is currently at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Number 6. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, went on a spree of ending lives with his firearm many times in New York that started in July 1976. He ended the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others by July 1977, terrorizing New Yorkers and gaining worldwide notoriety. David eluded the biggest police manhunt in the city's history while leaving letters that mocked the police and promised future crimes, which were highly publicized by the press. David was arrested on August 10, 1977, and subsequently indicted for 8 crimes that ended lives. He confessed to all of them and initially claimed to have been obeying orders of a demon manifested in the form of a dog belonging to his neighbor, Sam. After being found mentally competent to stand trial, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences in state prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. He then admitted that the dog and devil story was a hoax, which is shocking. Intense media coverage of the case made David a celebrity, and he seemed to enjoy it. In response, the New York State legislature enacted new statutes known popularly as Son of Sam laws, designed to keep criminals from financially profiting from the publicity created by their crimes. The statutes have remained in law in New York State despite various legal changes, and similar laws have been enacted in several other states. David is currently at Shagum Correctional Facility in New York. Number 5. Charles Cullen. Charles Cullen was a nurse who ended the lives of dozens of patients during a 16-year career spanning several New Jersey medical centers until being arrested in 2003. He confessed to committing as many as 40 deaths, at least 29 of which have been confirmed, though through interviews with the police, psychiatrists, and journalists suggest he committed many more, as some experts believe he has up to 400 victims. On March 10, 2006, Charles was brought into the courtroom of Lehigh County President Judge William H. Platt for a sentencing hearing. Charles, upset with the judge, kept repeating, "Your Honor, you need to step down," for 30 minutes until Judge Platt had Charles gagged with a cloth and duct tape. Even after being gagged, Charles continued to repeat the phrase. In the hearing, Judge Platt gave him an additional 6 life sentences. As part of his plea agreement, Charles has been working with law enforcement officials to identify additional victims. He was sentenced to 11 life sentences in 2006 and will not be eligible for parole until 2403. He is currently located at New Jersey State Prison in New Jersey. Number 4. Paul Bernardo. Paul Bernardo committed crimes together with his former wife Karla Homolka, who were nicknamed the Ken and Barbie Killers. He is known initially for taking advantage of people in Scarborough, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto, between 1987 and 1990, before ending the lives of 3 women with Karla. Among those victims was Karla's younger sister, Tammy Homolka. Karla took a plea bargain of 12 years imprisonment, and she began giving statements to investigators. She told police that Paul had boasted that he had taken advantage of as many as 30 women, twice as many as the police suspected. This plea bargain caused a lot of outrage and was seen as controversial. Karla was released from prison in 2005 and she settled in Quebec, where she married the brother of her lawyer, where she's rumored to still be today. But now, after Paul's capture and conviction, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and was later declared a dangerous offender, thus making it unlikely that he will ever be released from prison. Following his conviction, Paul confessed to taking advantage of 10 more victims, and he is currently being held at Millhaven Institution in Ontario, Canada. Number 3. Joseph James DeAngelo. Joseph James DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer, was a former police officer who ended the lives of 13 people, took advantage of 50 people, and had been involved in 120 burglaries in California between 1974 and 1986. He is responsible for at least 3 separate crime sprees throughout the state, each of which spawned a different nickname in the press before it became evident that they were committed by the same person. He was also linked to hundreds of incidents of thefts, burglaries, vandalism, peeping, stalking, and prowling. He wasn't arrested until 2018 though, when DNA tracing from family members on genealogy sites linked him to his crime. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 deaths and 13 counts of taking advantage of people. In August of that same year, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving time at Corcoran Prison in California. Number 2. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, was initially convicted of 48 separate deaths. As part of his plea bargain, another conviction was added, bringing the total number of convictions to 49. He ended the lives of women in the US state of Washington during the 1980s and 1990s. Now, most of Gary's victims were alleged to be sex workers and other women in vulnerable circumstances, including runaways. The press gave him his nickname after the first 5 victims were found in the Green River before his identity was known. He strangled his victims, usually by hand, and after strangling them, he would dump their bodies in forested and overgrown areas in King County, often returning to the bodies to take advantage of them. On November 30th, 2001, Gary was arrested for the deaths of 4 women whose cases were linked to him through DNA profiling evidence. As part of a plea bargain wherein he agreed to disclose the location of still missing women, he was spared the death penalty. He was sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole, an additional life sentence, and 480 more years of tampering with evidence. He is currently at Washington State Penitentiary in Washington State. And coming in at number 1 is Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton worked full-time at his family's pig farm after inheriting it in the early 1980s. It was at this point that it was believed he started ending people's lives. He ended their lives just like they were pigs. When he was done with their bodies, he would then feed them to his pigs to get rid of the evidence, which is just messed up. He was finally arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 for the deaths of 6 women and also the subject of a lengthy investigation that yielded evidence of numerous other deaths. Robert was charged with the deaths of an additional 20 women, many of them from Vancouver's downtown east side, but the charges were stayed by the Crown in 2010. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the longest possible sentence for second-degree murder under Canadian law at the time he was sentenced. The conviction was appealed twice by his lawyers, but ultimately rejected by Canada's Supreme Court. During the trial's first day of jury evidence, the Crown stated that Robert had confessed to 49 deaths to an undercover agent from the Office of Inspector General who was posing as a cellmate. The Crown reported that he told the officer that he wanted to end the life of another woman to make it an even 50, and that he was caught because he was sloppy. There was actually a two-part episode inspired by Robert on the popular crime drama Criminal Minds for the season 4 finale called To Hell and Back.
Starting us off at number 10, Juha Veikko Valjakala. I'm sure I butchered that completely, but just bear with me here. This rampant killer has had quite the in and out experience with prison. His first release was in 1988 when he and his girlfriend Marita wasted no time getting back into trouble. One night Juha stole a bike from a random family and the father and son of the house witnessed the theft, so they decided to chase after him. The assailant led them to a cemetery where he took both of their lives but was caught by the victim's wife, who had gone out looking for her husband and son. Making sure to cover his tracks, Juha struck the wife in the head with his rifle before stabbing her to finish the job. He and Marita fled the scene and were later found and arrested for the triple homicide. During the trial, the couple blamed each other for the gruesome events, but ultimately Juha was charged with the heftier life sentence and diagnosed with a psychopathic personality. While in prison, he continued to cause issues, trying to escape on multiple occasions, but still by 2001 was granted day parole. Often he wouldn't return, but I guess he did so with enough consistency that he was fully released in 2009. But then in 2012 he was right back in after committing arson. Fast forward to 2014 where he received day parole again, until one day in 2015 he left prison and never returned. I mean, honestly, with his violent history and blatant attempts to escape prison, I can't believe they even gave him parole again. To this day, no one knows his whereabouts. Next up at number 9, Nikolai Dumagliev. Again, sorry, I'm sure I'm saying these names terribly. Some call him Metal Fang. Nikolai is a convicted killer responsible for the death of at least 10 people between 1979 to 1991. Although he had already taken about 6 lives, he wasn't arrested until 1979 after killing a fellow fireman in a drunken stupor. Upon admitting him, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and less than a year later, he was released. He wasted no time adding another 3 victims to his hit list, but it was his 9th killing that led to his final capture. He had invited some friends over to his home, but for whatever reason, he decided that this was the perfect time to kill one of them and begin dismembering the body in another room while his guests were still in the house. The others went looking for him as he'd been gone a while and caught him in the horrendous act. Upon witnessing it, they fled the house and immediately reported it to the police, who then rushed over to his house to find him eating the body on his hands and knees and covered in blood. In such a state of shock, Nikolai actually managed to evade them and fled to the mountains fully nude and with only a hatchet in his hands. Eventually he was tracked down and arrested, and with his existing diagnosis was deemed unfit for trial and sent to an institution. He later escaped but was soon found, and although he isn't released yet, the question for his discharge is still very much on the table according to his doctors, which is wild. So let's just hope they don't go through with that. Coming in at number 8, Matthias Blink. Once a second lieutenant in the Swedish army, during his time serving, he was known to have some really serious mental health problems that eventually led to a total mental breakdown and the death of 7 people. The day was June 11th, 1994, and after drowning his problems in alcohol, Flink went home to change his clothes. Once he was at home, he changed into his field uniform and grabbed a rifle as well as 150 rounds of ammunition. From there, he took a walk down to a nearby park where he shot 6 women and 2 men at random. He fled the scene, hiding out in a crane for a few hours until he finally decided to walk walk back home along the railroad, and it's there that he was caught by police. All but one of his victims lost their lives, and despite a bit of back and forth trying to determine if he should go to prison or an institution, ultimately the court charged him for the crimes and sentenced him to life. In 2008, Flink requested his sentence be changed from life to 25 years, and it was originally denied. But then in 2010, his request was accepted with the amendment of making it a 32-year sentence. But I guess due to good behavior, in 2014 he was officially released after only serving 20 years, and he remains walking free to this day. Coming in at number 7, Louis Van Scoor. Notoriously recognized as the apartheid killer, Louis was an active killer in South Africa between 1986 to 1989. And believe it or not, this is how he would target most of his victims. It's believed Louis would often take the lives of those who were in the process of surrendering to him, and almost always his victims were people of color. Allegedly, Louis would even sometimes snatch passersby off the street. Perhaps they had been a witness to his crimes, or maybe he just felt like it. At the time, the South African laws were a little bit loose surrounding his killings, and combined with the institutional racism from apartheid, Louis again and again and again walked free from his homicides. The true number of his victims is not known, but once in an interview he didn't deny killing over 100 people. While not necessarily confession, most people would deny something that they didn't do. Eventually he was convicted for taking the lives of 9 people and sentenced to 20 years, but for whatever reason, as it turns out, he only served 12 and was released in 2004. Coming in at number 6, Arfin Nesset. On the outside, he looked like an unsuspecting nursing home manager, but in reality, he's believed to have killed even more than some of the most prolific criminals out there. In 1977, after police interrogation, it was discovered Nesset had purchased an unusually large amount of Curacet, a poisonous muscle relaxant. Nesset claims he originally bought it to kill his dog, but confessed to killing 25 of his patients with the drug as well. Now, this was just what he confessed. The number is believed to be as high as 138. Although at the start of the trial he pled guilty, later Nesset came forward saying that was actually a false confession made under duress and that he was actually innocent. Still, he was found guilty for the death of 22 patients under his care and sentenced to 21 years in prison, which at the time was the max sentence you could receive in Norway. However, just 12 years later, in 2004, Nesset was released for good behavior and is currently living out his life under a new name in an undisclosed location. Coming in at number 5, Mitchell Johnson and Andrew Golden. The year was 1998, and teen pals Mitchell and Andrew decided to steal the car of Mitchell's parents. And oh boy, do I wish that is where this story stopped. The next step in their plan was to head over to Mitchell's grandparents' house to steal a bevy of unlocked firearms that were stowed there, and then finally drive them to their school. Once they got there, they rang a fire alarm to force the populace outside and hid in the bushes so that no one could see them. Once everyone was outside, the killing began. They shot at their peers, killing 4 of them along with one of the staff members that had been trying to protect the younger victims, and another 10 were seriously injured. Both boys were arrested for the crimes and immediately confessed, but due to their ages were tried as minors and given short sentences. As a result, Johnson was released in 2005 at the age of 21, and Golden followed 2 years later on his 21st birthday as well. As of 2016, they are the only living school attackers who walk free. Coming in at number 4, Karla Homolka. Responsible for the death of at least 3 women with the help of her husband Paul Bernardo in the early 90s, it is wild that Karla is released. For starters, one of the 3 lives she took was her own sister. Allegedly, Karla gave her to her husband as a sadistic gift before drugging her with animal tranquilizers that forced her to choke on her own vomit. A few years later, in 1993, Bernardo was arrested for their crimes, and Homolka was quick to throw him under the bus, saying that she was an unwilling accomplice under his fist and acted out of fear that she could be killed if she didn't comply. So with that, Carla took a plea deal and was only sentenced to 12 years versus her husband's life sentence. But the craziest part is that authorities actually received video footage that proved she was way more than a victim of the whole situation. She was actually a perpetrator of many of the crimes herself. But with her plea deal already settled, they never changed her sentence. Fast forward to 2005, and Carla was released from prison before relocating to Quebec, where she remarried and had 2 kids. The town she currently resides in is reportedly not happy to have her there, and there are frequent issues from other parents when she tries to volunteer or involve herself in any way with the community. Next up at number 3, David McGreevy. Dubbed the Monster of Worcester, David McGreevy was an ex-Navy man who, after his dismissal in 1971, went back to live with his parents in Worcestershire. His time with his parents was a bit rough. Allegedly, he was fired from a lot of jobs, his fiancée left him, and he more or less drowned his feelings in alcohol. Eventually, his parents got fed up with him and his drinking, so they kicked him out. From there, he moved in with some friends, Clive and Elsie Ralph, and their family. According to Elsie, David was actually a really nice man most of the time and was great with her daughters and son, and was known to frequently take care of them when she and Clive were out. But one night, after coming home drunk, he committed some of the most gruesome acts I have ever read about. When he was in trial for the brutal crimes, he immediately pleaded guilty, and the hearing lasted only 8 minutes, as there was no defense plea, no motive, and no case of diminished responsibility. David was ultimately sentenced for life with a minimum of 20 years. Then in 2018, after 45 years behind bars, he was released, much to the anger of Elsie and Clive, who felt they had been promised he would remain in prison for life. But according to his parole hearing, he has changed incredibly over the near half a century and no longer seemed like a threat to society. Coming in at number 2, Wolfgang Abel and Marco Furlan. These two met in their teens and both bonded over their extremist and supremacist views immediately. In 1977, they decided to enact a plan to, as they put it, clean up the streets of Europe. This cleansing involved targeting people who were gay, individuals with substance abuse issues, and escorts, among nearly every minority group as well. After each kill, they would leave behind leaflets with the bodies, covered in a certain evil German war symbol, proclaiming their motives and beliefs behind why they were targeting these victims. It is believed that the duo are responsible for taking between 10 to 28 lives during their 7-year killing spree. Upon their arrest, they denied any involvement in the atrocities, instead saying they were a scapegoat for the police who hadn't been able to find the real assailants. Both were sentenced to 30 years for their horrendous acts, and not long after, copycats began popping up all over Italy and Germany from others who shared their racist ideologies. Flash forward to 2009, and Abel was admitted to house arrest, where he stayed until his official release in 2016. Furlan was released back in 2010, and according to recent reports, neither are in contact with each other and are no longer friends. So let's just hope that means their plan to cleanse the city is through. And last up, in our number 1 spot, Caroline Wood. In 1986, a woman named Gwendolyn Graham moved to Grand Rapids and shortly after started work at a nursing home. It was at this job she met the infamous Caroline Wood, and her life would be forever changed. The pair quickly became lovers after they met, and allegedly after a year together started to kill. All of their victims were late-stage Alzheimer's patients at the nursing home, all of whom were far too weak to fight off their attacks. As the story goes, Caroline Wood was riddled with guilt for what she and Gwendolyn did and confessed the atrocities to her ex-husband. He promptly told the police what she had done, and with this information, they ordered new autopsies to be done on the victims, and the women were both charged for the 5 killings. But here is where it gets twisty. Gwendolyn came forward saying that she had never actually been in the room during the attacks, and that she acted as someone on the watch. But when the pair was on trial, Caroline Wood had the same story, and it seems as though the jury took Caroline's side. Gwendolyn was convicted for first degree and got 5 life sentences with no chance of parole, whereas Caroline pleaded guilty to second degree and got off with a sentence of 20 to 40 years. But allegedly, Caroline told another woman it had been her all along, and that she set up Gwendolyn as a means of payback for leaving her. After 8 dismissals for parole, eventually she was granted leave in 2018, but Gwendolyn will remain for the rest of her days. Starting us off at number 10, Rashad Hawkins. He may not be evil, but he certainly isn't innocent. Rashad Hawkins was attending child support court and was sentenced to serve some time due to his negligence and failure to pay. Now, instead of doing the time or paying what he owed, Rashad decided running was the route he was gonna take. Before he was even taken into custody, Hawkins managed to evade authorities by jumping over a second-story railing and fleeing the building before they could catch him. He stayed on the run for 20 days before eventually being caught and now faces charges of criminal trespassing, assault, and evading arrest. So all in all, he made it much worse on himself. Next up at number 9, Nicholas Garrison. Arrested with several drug charges back in 2020, Nicholas tried his luck and made a run while in the courthouse. Out of nowhere, he manages to escape the grasps of the sheriffs detaining him and bolts, pushing past others in the courthouse, with the sheriffs chasing after him close behind. Once outside of the chamber, he headed for the staircase, at which point the sheriff made a leaping dive down the stairs head first to try and catch him, ultimately breaking a few ribs and getting a concussion. Garrison managed to escape him and sprinted down the stairs as fast as he could. He was later found in a motel and arrested, and now faces far worse charges than his original 6 months. Next up at number 8, Mysterious Man. Now, unfortunately, I could not find the name of this escapee. All that I know is that he was from Washington, so if you know his name, leave it below in the comments. The mystery man took off his prison uniform while still in the courtroom, which I can only assume was empty. But if that was the case, why was a convict left alone in the first place? Whatever, that's not the point. Now, stripped of his uniform and semi-blending in with the civilians in the courthouse, he bolts straight out the front door, running past many witnesses. Although from what I can tell on the blurry footage, it does look like he was running barefoot, which, I don't know, that's kind of clue number 2 for me. People aren't generally running around barefoot in a courthouse with good news, but hey, what do I know? Anyways, he was found a few hours later and put back into custody, and like every other person on this list, things were much worse from there on out for him. And next up at number 7, Tanner Jacobson and Cody Howard. I'm gonna go out on a limb here with little to no evidence of this being fact, but I'm gonna guess that most courtroom judges aren't starting off their day expecting to have to run around chasing delinquents down a flight of stairs. Well, whether Judge Buzzard saw it coming or not, this is exactly what his day entailed. When 2 young men, Tanner Jacobson and Cody Howard, came into his courtroom on October 16th, 2018. The 2 men made a run for it straight out of the courtroom, still in their handcuffs, and the judge quickly shed his robe and bolted right after them, chasing them down 4 flights of stairs, all the while yelling, "Stop, stop, you're only making this worse." But still they continued. Buzzard only managed to catch Howard, but Jacobson didn't make it much further before being caught by authorities after just a few blocks outside. They should have listened to the judge, because they did indeed make it much worse. Next up at number 6, Leonid Gracier. In 2019, Leonid was convicted for killing his younger sister, and upon his arrest told authorities Satan had demanded him. Well, it wouldn't be the first time we've heard that excuse. Seemingly unfazed by what he had committed, he was put into custody in Moscow, where apparently it's common to put prisoners into these boxes to detain them. Perhaps what they seemed to forget was handcuffs, however, as the killer tried to escape the confines by crawling up into the ceiling of the courthouse. He was nearly successful, but didn't manage to get very far before police tased him and pulled him back down from the ceiling. During his confession, he said he didn't regret his actions and essentially that he stood by his crimes and said that he had made everything better in doing them. So while he didn't technically succeed in his escape, I think we can all agree that we're glad that's the case. Coming in at number 5, a helping hand. Like most things in life, things are easier with the help of your friends. But unfortunately in this case, Callum was a 21-year-old helping his teenage friend escape a 5-month jail sentence. At first, the teen was just convicted for stealing a cell phone and for whatever reason decided his best option was to make a break for it. Bailiffs went after him but weren't actually too worried at first, as the door to exit required someone to push a button on the other side of it for it to open. Well, little did they know he had someone to do that very job. The accomplice, Callum Finter, ended up also being arrested for helping the teen escape, but he tried to claim that it was a total accident and he didn't mean to push the button. I don't know, but it seems pretty intentional to me looking at the footage there. This story didn't seem to win over anyone, and he was ultimately sentenced to 3 months in jail for aiding his friend in his escape. The teen was on the run for 2 days but was later found and ended up having another 6 months added to his sentence. Have you ever heard the saying, not all help is good help? Just saying, it might have been something to think about before getting caught up in all this mess. Next up at number 4, Quantrell Schwartzlow. This piece of work was under arrest for some brutal domestic violence, and despite that, was still left alone. Now, I don't know what it is about leaving criminals alone for a minute, especially those that are committed for some serious and dangerous crimes, but it just seems to me like once they're in custody, they should be continuously observed. Well, as you guessed it, Quantrell should have been kept under a closer watch. Though he was handcuffed, that didn't seem to stop him from escaping out of a window in an interrogation room in what can only be described as a swan dive out of the building. How he managed it, I don't quite understand. How he didn't break every bone in his body on the way down, also a mystery. But luckily he was caught about 3 hours later hiding out at a friend's house and was eventually charged, not only for his escape, but also the unruly crimes he committed on his girlfriend. Next up at number 3, Christopher Lee Ruffin. Back in 2012, while appearing in court for a probation violation, Christopher was sentenced to another 90 days in jail. Now, I don't know what he was originally charged for or any of the details of his case, but all in all, 90 days doesn't seem like it's as bad as it could get. But apparently it was still too much for Christopher. His runaway is especially wild to me because it's not just that he managed to escape, but he was actually tased by 2 of the bailiffs and still managed to continue running while being tased. He then ran past security and straight out the front door. In the next few hours, he tried to get multiple rides, threatening strangers to drive him out of town, but the police ended up catching up to him and took him back to jail. Now, this is just a wild guess, but I have a feeling he was looking at more than 90 days after the shenanigans he pulled. Coming in at number 2, Deontay Rasiles. In 2014, this convict was arrested for the burglary and killing of a woman named Jill Sue, for which he claimed he was being framed. Well, as he puts it, to prove his innocence, he decided to escape the courthouse with the help of some other inmates and his girlfriend. And I mean really, what says innocent more than a secret inmate collab and a getaway car? It seems like his accomplice helped to remove his handcuffs, and then he had some twin brothers distract a guard and give him a signal for when to make a run for it. He then slipped out of a fire exit and ran to the getaway car where his girlfriend had a change of clothes for him, and they drove off in a flash. This was a very high profile case considering what he was on trial for, and caused a huge manhunt across Florida, with SWAT teams and helicopters roaming the city all hours of the day. He was missing for a week, but thankfully was found. Now back in custody, he faces a potential life sentence with the death penalty for his crimes, although he still maintains his innocence in the entire ordeal. And last up in our number 1 spot, Ted Bundy. Ah yes, the notorious and downright evil killer who needs no introduction. But despite being convicted of killing and committing other horrors to at least 30 women, he was granted way more independence than should have been allowed to someone of his security level. People felt he was very charming and seemed to conveniently forget what he was in custody for. Well, Bundy took advantage of that, and in June of 1977, while on trial for one of his many killings, he was left alone in a courtroom library to prepare, as he was representing himself in court. While alone and out of sight from the guards, Bundy managed to open a window and make a run for it. He jumped out out of the second-story window, injuring his ankle, and managed to disappear into the woods for 6 days. He was, of course, found, convicted, and eventually sentenced to death for all of his crimes, but it's one of the craziest escape stories to this day.
Starting off our list, in our number 10 spot, we have Vicki Dawn Jackson. Vicki was a woman who worked as a nurse for a number of years. She first got her nursing license in 1989, but it wasn't until the 2000s when things took a seriously dark turn. Between December of 2000 and February of 2001, the hospital that Vicki was working for recorded a number of deaths that was unusual. It was a higher amount. Most of these patients were in the age range of 60 to 100 years old, and of course people just chalked this up to the advanced age of most of these patients, but a rumor began to spread that someone just might be responsible. After this, the hospital's administrator noticed that a vial of a drug called Mivacron had gone missing. You might see where I'm going with this. As it turns out, the person responsible was Nurse Vicki, and she had at least 10 patients whose lives she took by giving them too much of this missing drug. It was a muscle relaxant. Take in that this is 10 people between December and February. That is an unbelievable amount of people in a remarkably short amount of time. You might be wondering why she took these lives, and apparently she did it when she found these people rude, or quote, too demanding. In our number 9 spot today, we have Daniel Perez. Also known as Lou Castro, Daniel led a cult that was located on a 20-acre property in a rural area just north of Wichita. He convinced his followers that he had magical powers, and he told them all that he was a centuries-old angel who needed to commit some horrific crimes in order to stay alive. These crimes would have certainly been more than enough to throw him on this list, but he of course couldn't just stop at committing one type of crime. He had to make sure he really stole the show on just being the worst. Basically, he had the really clever idea to use his followers' life insurance policies to live a lavish lifestyle, like as if no one would think that's weird or suspicious. While some of these life insurance policies were collected through regular means, of course that kind of greed only leads to evil things, which of course means that he ended up taking one of his followers' lives so that he could collect the cash. It is thought that he also contributed to the deaths of some of the other people's life insurance policies he cashed in on, but unfortunately there was never any evidence that would be able to substantiate that claim. Despite this, however, on April 21st, 2010, authorities were able to arrest Daniel, and he was charged with 28 felonies. In February of 2015, he was convicted on all counts and received a sentence of 80 years in jail, where he remains. In our number 8 spot today, we have Chester Turner. Chester is an American serial killer who, on April 30th, 2007, was convicted of taking the lives of 11 women in the Los Angeles area, and on June 19th, 2014, he was convicted of 4 more that they were able to tie back to him. He has been referred to by prosecutors as one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history, and if you know Los Angeles' history, that says a lot. In his original trial that led to his conviction, Chester was sentenced to death, but at the following one in 2014, he also received an additional death sentence. In the end, like with a lot of these kinds of stories, DNA came to save the day and help authorities find out who was committing these horrible, horrible crimes. In our number 7 spot today, we have Michael Bear Carson and Susan Carson. This couple is not one that anyone would want to encounter. The stories of these two come from the 80s. They were married, and on the outside they appeared like just a couple of harmless hippies. We all know not to judge a book by its cover though. In the end, they would go on to become known as the San Francisco Witch Killers. Didn't know San Francisco had so many witches running around. Basically, together the pair took the lives of 3 separate people between 1981 and 1983. They started off by killing their roommate, who Susan claimed was a witch, and said that she was stealing her quote health, power, and beauty. They next killed one guy that they worked on a farm with because they said he was a demon, and the final person they took the life of unfortunately picked up the pair as they were hitchhiking, and they took his life because they claimed that he was a quote black witch, whatever that means. Essentially, they were just committing crimes against people that they claimed to be witches. The pair were each tried and convicted for each separate crime and are both serving sentences of 75 years to life, and of course neither of them have shown any kind of remorse for what they've done. In our number 6 spot today, we have Samuel Dietman. Samuel is just one half of the pair known as the serial shooters. He, along with a man named Dale, were actively committing these crimes between May of 2005 and August of 2006, and basically they were arsonists who would randomly set fire to objects, but they would also drive around and commit random acts of violence, taking people's lives. In the end, a series of tips is what led investigators to identify the perpetrators of these horrible crimes, in particular one from a friend of Samuel who explained that Sam had actually confessed to some of the killings one night while drinking. In Dale's trial, trial, he was sentenced to death 6 times, and his brother, who was later found out to have assisted in some of the crimes, was sentenced to 25 years. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dale ended up taking his own life while on death row, which is why this point mainly focuses on Samuel, who remains in prison. In our number 5 spot today, we have Keith Hunter Jesperson, also known as the Happy Face Killer. After the body of his first victim was found, Keith had someone else actually claim to be responsible for his crime. You would think that this would have been his ideal scenario, but that was not the case. He wanted to be known for his crimes. So, to help himself get media attention, he drew a smiley face on a bathroom wall hundreds of miles away from his crime scene, and here he left an anonymous letter where he confessed to the crime and provided proof. He didn't end up receiving a reply, so he decided to write more letters to the media and to the authorities, each signed with a smiley face. In the end, Keith was initially caught after he became the prime suspect in the death of his girlfriend at the time. Previously, his victims had been people that he had no connection to, so this was truly the mistake the authorities needed to catch him. Keith then admitted to his crimes, and while he has formally been linked to 8 deaths, he has confessed to somewhere around 185. Keith was tried and sentenced to life without parole for his heinous crimes, and he remains in prison at Oregon State Penitentiary. In our number 4 spot today, we have Quincy Allen. Quincy Allen is a man who went on a crime spree between July and August of 2002, where he took the lives of 4 people. His crime spree was actually inspired while he was in prison serving time for stealing a vehicle. It was here that a fellow inmate decided to start recruiting others and told him that he could get him a job as a mafia hitman, and this is all that Quincy needed to be inspired. As soon as he was out of prison, he began practicing for his new, upcoming career. Quincy started off his horrific crime spree on July 7th, 2002 by attacking a 51-year-old homeless man who was sleeping at the time. Luckily, this man was able to survive this attack. His crimes continued until he was arrested on August 14th, 2002. After his arrest and trial, Quincy received a sentence of death and is still on death row awaiting execution. His sentencing did not deter him from the criminal life, however, as in 2009, Quincy, along with another inmate, planned an attack on a correctional officer at the prison they both reside at. In the end, the guards had to use rubber bullets to subdue the pair. Quincy was intended to be executed on January 8th, 2010, but there was a stay of execution that was accepted, and as of July 26, 2022, Quincy's death sentence was overturned. In our number 3 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, or the Son of Sam, is an American serial killer who terrorized New York from July of 1976 to July of 1977. He took the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others, all while eluding the biggest manhunt in New York City history. He was one of those really arrogant ones who leaves the little notes for police promising to do it again, kind of like taunting them. Well, his arrogant self was caught for his crimes, and he was arrested on August 10th, 1977, and he was indicted. He confessed to all of his crimes and claimed that he was just obeying the orders of a demon that had manifested itself in the form of a dog that belonged to his neighbor. Okay. Sure. He was found mentally competent to stand trial, and he pleaded guilty to his crimes, which left him sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which we know, but he did say that instead he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as a part of that. These claims were investigated, but no one has ever been able to confirm or deny these claims. In our number 2 spot today, we have Sean Great. Sean is a serial killer who committed a series of crimes from 2006 until he was apprehended in 2016. Throughout his decade of criminal activity, it is thought that he took the lives of at least 5 people. In September 2016, Sean was arrested and later indicted for 2 killings, as well as kidnapping and harming a woman whose 911 call actually led to his arrest. At the same time, in another county next door, he was also being charged with 2 other deaths, as well as another one from all the way back in 2006. This final count from all of those years ago was actually an unsolved Jane Doe case who had been unidentified for 12 years. When Sean confessed to this crime, he wasn't even sure who she was, he just said that he believed her name was Dana. On May 7th, 2018, Sean was convicted on 2 of the counts, and on March 1st, 2019, he pleaded guilty to 2 of the others, and on September 11th, 2019, he pleaded guilty to an additional count. In the end, he was sentenced to death and has remained on death row since that final plea and sentencing, and he is currently scheduled to be executed in 2025. In a very bittersweet turn of events, in June of 2019, that Jane Doe victim was finally able to be identified through the DNA Doe Project, and she was identified as 23-year-old Dana Nicole Lowry from Minden, Louisiana. It definitely can't bring her back, but there is a lot of comfort in knowing that her family finally received some answers. In our number 1 spot today, we have Glenn Stewart Godwin. In 1980, Glenn was working in California and wasn't really living a life of crime, so it's pretty surprising that in this year, he and his roommate decided to make a plan to rob someone they knew who was once a friend of theirs. Of course, things go awry and it turns into a botched robbery, and Glenn ends up taking the life of the person they were robbing. They then tried to blow up the crime scene to get rid of any evidence, but of course that didn't work and also just made them look even more insane. Both Glenn and his roommate were both tried and convicted for the crimes in 1983. This is not where the story ends. In 1987, Glenn tried to escape prison and failed, and this landed him at a higher security prison. At this new prison, he attempted escape again, and this time, he was actually successful. He fled to Mexico, where he tried, unsuccessfully, to be a part of the illegal drug trade. He was arrested again and sentenced in Mexico, and this is when American authorities began the process of getting him extradited. During this process, Glenn decided that it would be a brilliant idea to take the life of an inmate who was a member of the Mexican drug cartel, which very obviously slowed the process of extradition. This gave him time to plan another escape, which he did in 1991. And since then, he's been on the run. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Scott Lee Kimball. This is a man who took the lives of at least 4 people between the years of 2003 and 2004, but I say the words "at least" because although it's never been able to be proven, it is thought that he actually took the lives of somewhere around 20 plus people. During the first of his 2 crime-filled years, Scott actually worked as an FBI informant, but to none of our surprise now, he was one of the worst informants of all time. Not only did he rarely provide any sort of evidence that actually ended up being useful, but much of the evidence he provided ended up later being proven false. He was caught in 2006 not only for these horrific crimes, but many others as well, which included things like fraud and forgery. He ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison, and he is still currently serving that sentence. In our number 9 spot today, we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40, he just couldn't remember the names of them all. But, of course, he could remember the details of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only 1 count of his crimes, but he just ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted, "Your Honor, you need to step down," for 25 minutes, even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly unbelievable. Charles was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences and will be eligible for parole in 2403. So let's hope he doesn't make it that long. In our number 8 spot today, we have Hebert Mullen. Okay, I'm a true crime fan, and the more I learn, the more that being a person living in California in the 1970s seems like a terrifying experience. Like seriously, there were so many horrible, some of the worst serial killers who were active in the state at this time. I don't know how anyone got any sleep or did anything. Hebert is just one of the many who were active at this time. It is said that Hebert, before his crime spree, was quite bright and well liked. He was voted most likely to succeed in high school, but by his mid-30s, his life had taken a dark turn, and he was now a serial killer who would go on to take the lives of at least 13 people. To be perfectly honest, Hebert definitely had some mental illness struggles that greatly contributed to his horrific crimes that he committed. That does not excuse what he has done, but it would be completely unfair to not mention that part of the story. Experts have explained that Hebert suffers from paranoid schizophrenia, and he believed that his crimes were preventing earthquakes in California. He only believed this sort of fantasy more after his arrest because coincidentally, there were no earthquakes in California during his crime spree, but there was one shortly after his arrest. In 1973, he was sentenced to life in prison, and although he has been up for parole a number of times, he has been denied every single time, with the next hearing taking place in 2025. In our number 7 spot today, we have Luis Garavito. Luis gained a nickname from the media of the Beast, and I think that's a great indication of the nature of his atrocious crimes. He is said to be one of the worst serial killers in the entire world, and it is believed that his victim count is up in the 300s range, which is absolutely shocking. He confessed to 147 crimes, and he was found guilty on 139 of those counts, which puts his sentence at 1,853 years, but here's the thing. This trial took place in Colombia, where he lives, and there is a law which puts the maximum sentence to 30 years. He was sentenced in 1999, meaning there's only a few years of this sentence left. He also had years taken off of his sentence because he assisted police in the search to recover some of the victims' bodies, which means that just next year, in 2023, he is eligible for parole. According to Luis himself, he committed these crimes because he had made a deal with the devil, and he explained that satanic ritual was involved in all of his crimes. In our number 6 spot today, we have Randy Kraft. More commonly known as the Scorecard Killer, this monster is thought to have tormented and then taken the lives of 16 different young men from 1972 to 1983. Most of his crimes were committed in California, and he most often would pick up his victims as they were hitchhiking near military bases. The reason for his nickname is because of this strange and sinister list he had that had cryptic references to each of his victims. Based on this list, it is thought that he may have taken the lives of more than 50 people, which is beyond disturbing. When Randy was finally caught, he was pulled over by the police, who, when they went around to the passenger side, discovered the body of a 25-year-old Marine who would become Randy's final victim. Randy has been sitting on death row at San Quentin for over 25 years for these crimes, and despite his conviction and death sentence, and the gruesome discovery on the day he was caught, Randy still maintains his innocent plea. Something's telling me he just might be lying. In our number 5 spot today, we have Dennis Rader. The BTK, whose real name is Dennis Rader, was one of the worst serial killers from 1974 to 1991. He left taunting letters for police and newspapers where he described his crimes, but thankfully, this annoyingly large and misplaced ego is what led to his demise. After a 10-year hiatus on his disgusting crimes, he couldn't keep his mouth shut, so he began communicating with the media again in 2004. This communication, combined with his lack of knowledge on how technology works, led to his arrest in 2005. During his trial, he didn't apologize for his crimes, but he did describe them in full detail, which is horrifying and extremely eerie. I could not even imagine having to be there during that. After his trial, he ended up being sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. When Rader was first arrested, when the police were taking him to the station, an officer asked him, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" To which he replied, "Oh, I have some suspicions why." In our number 4 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the second most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were either sex workers or women in vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the location of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared the death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not only did he say that he chose the type of victims he did because they were, quote, easy to pick up, and that he, quote, hated most of them, but he also called his crimes his career. So, do with that what you will. In our number 3 spot today we have Rose West. Rose West is an English serial killer who committed her crimes alongside her husband. He definitely also would make a spot on this list, but he decided to take his own life in 1995 after being arrested while awaiting trial. Really strong stand-up man. The terrible pair were investigated and subsequently arrested for taking 9 lives together, with Rose receiving an additional charge for another 10th life. During the court proceedings, against the advice of her counsel, Rose decided that she would testify herself, and what a trip that was. During her testimony, she sometimes was very tearful and dramatic, but of course, an act like that can be hard to keep up, so other times she was just cracking jokes and laughing. Imagine doing your tight 5 while you're on trial for the worst of the worst crimes. Luckily, it seems as though the jury hated that as much as I do, because they came back with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 10 crimes. Get this, in prison, Rose West met Myra Hindley, which if you don't know who that is, she committed a bunch of very similar crimes with her husband, boyfriend, partner, whatever as well, and the two became besties and they even had an affair throughout the whole thing. Rose is still trying to say that she was totally innocent and that Fred was completely responsible for all of the crimes. Also, to make this story even crazier, for those of you who watched part 1 of this series, the number 1 spot on the last one, her name was Joanna Denny. Well, Joanna was in the same prison as Rose, and in 2019 she threatened to kill her. Because of this, they had to move Rose secretly to another location because there was a very real threat to her life. In our number 2 spot today we have Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski is most often referred to as the Unabomber due to the atrocious crimes that he committed. He was known for being quite bright from a young age, and it is believed that he had an IQ of about 167. He was accepted into Harvard at the age of just 16, and he went on to receive a PhD. At 25, things were still looking bright for the guy as he landed himself a job as an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, but just 2 years later he resigned from that position and his life took quite a drastic and dark turn. In 1971, it is said that Ted moved to a remote cabin in Montana that had no electricity or running water. From 1971 until 1977, Ted learned to live a hermit, off-the-grid lifestyle while learning different survival skills, but once 1978 rolled around, he was ready to start his terror campaign. From here until 1995, he began a nationwide bombing against people who were involved with modern technology. He planted these weapons or would mail them, and in the end took the lives of 3 people and severely injured 23. Just like many of these kinds of people, his own ego and delusions got in the way, because on April 24th, 1995, he sent an anonymous handwritten letter that was addressed to the police via the New York Times. His own brother ended up recognizing his handwriting, however, and that's the tip that he gave to the FBI. Ted was then captured, tried, and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. In our number 1 spot today we have Christopher Scarver. Okay, Christopher is a little different than the others on this list, and if you're unfamiliar with his story, you'll soon find out why. Basically, on June 1st, 1990, Christopher showed up at the Wisconsin Conservation Corps Training Program office, and there he demanded money from the man he found. When the man only gave him $15, Christopher went on to shoot him. Christopher then went and demanded money from another man and continued to shoot the man he had already shot until this second man gave him money. Christopher was caught and convicted for this horrible crime, but the story does not end here. On November 28, 1994, Christopher was assigned work detail with 2 other inmates. One was Jesse Anderson, who had taken the life of his own wife, and the other was none other than prolific serial killer and monster himself, Jeffrey Dahmer. Well, when the 3 were left alone, Christopher took a bar from a piece of equipment in the exercise room and used that to basically beat and kill the other 2. I'm not gonna lie, there's no excuse and no reason for any of the crimes these people committed, including these ones, but there is a very weird sort of poetic justice to that. Christopher was tried again for these 2 crimes and received 2 more life sentences. Apparently in 2012 it was announced that he wants to write a tell-all book about the killing of Dahmer, which is definitely bizarre, but we'll see if that ever comes to fruition, I guess.
Number 10. Richard Ramirez. Okay, here we go, right off the hop. Richard, who is also known as the Night Stalker, he was a serial killer who terrorized the streets of LA back in the 80s. He was known for, invading homes, which left him initially being dubbed as the walk-in killer, but he had another signature that was concerning to many people as well, especially during the height of the satanic panic. This is not good. Richard was known for leaving behind different satanic messages at the scene of his crimes. Because of his satanic signature, after he left his first pentagram at the scene of a crime, authorities became became worried that he was just a Charles Manson copycat, but instead he was, his own kind of monster. Nice. It is said that he would leave more pentagrams behind while also telling his victims to swear to Satan instead of swearing to God. During his court appearances, he would hold up a pentagram, and after pleading not guilty, he said, "Hail Satan." Yep, it would appear otherwise, my friend. Okay. Number 9. John Dee. John Dee was a scientist from the mid-1500s. Okay, we're going way back for this next one. In Elizabethan fashion, the scientist also fancied the occult, because I guess they were all bored back then. He worked alongside Edward Kelly. Now at the time, John Dee was working in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. To show you what kind of role he played in, a functioning society, John Dee casted an astrological chart in order to determine when the queen should be crowned. Yeah, he was one of those guys. So cut to 1581, both John Dee and Edward Kelly both claimed to communicate to the other side via crystal balls. Eventually the town wasn't cool with this guy speaking to angels or demons, because yeah, surprise, surprise, not everyone's on board with that. What'd you know? So the queen sent him to Manchester. She's like, get out of here. But when he arrived, he was warden. He was warden of Manchester Collegiate Church. John Dee refused to be part of exorcisms, but a table with an odd demonic bird mark found afterwards. So he's been busy, it seems. This mark is said to be from the hoof of the devil when John Dee summoned him. The British Museum still has John's demonic obsidian mirror if you want to take a peek yourself and see, how those curls are doing. Number 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey is one of the most well-known serial killers, with his crimes taking place from 1978 all the way to 1991. His crimes are far too brutal to really get into, but he's known for taking the lives of 17 different people. Now at his trial, not only did he plead not guilty, but his attorney had some interesting words for the court. His attorney stated that his bloody pattern had caused him to believe that he was the devil, which was intended to, bolster his insanity plea. His attorney said that he became enamored, overwhelmed, even caught up in the character from the movie The Exorcist 3. Yeah, said character was Satan. Yeah, if you're thinking, oh, which one? Is it the neighbor? No, the devil. Not only was Jeffrey found to be sane and ended up being sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison, of course, but not too long after his sentence started, he was killed by a fellow inmate. Number 7. Louis Garavito. Louis gained a nickname from the media called the Beast, so that's gonna tip you off of where this one's gonna go. Louis is said to be one of the worst serial killers of all time, and it's believed that his victim count is somewhere in the 300s. That is brutal. Now he's confessed to 147 crimes, and he was found guilty on 139 of them, which puts his sentence at 1,853 years. But here's the thing. His trial took place in Colombia, of course where he lives, and there's a law there which puts the maximum sentence to only 30 years. So yeah, he shaved a couple hundred off of that, I guess. He was sentenced in 1999, so you can do a little bit of quick math there. And according to Louis himself, he committed these crimes because he had made a deal with the devil, and he explained that a satanic ritual was involved in all of his crimes. Number 6. H.H. Holmes. He's considered America's first serial killer, and he was especially gruesome. H.H. went to medical school, and shortly after finishing, he began killing people in order to steal their property. He built himself a huge, horrifying house that he'd built to include things like secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, doors that lock from the outside with gas jets on the inside. He even had to kill him to cremate the bodies. Not only would he get close to women to take control of their finances and then, ultimately kill them, but he would also require his employees to take out life insurance policies that named him as the beneficiary. It isn't exactly known how many victims he had, but it's thought to be somewhere over 200. He was sentenced to death when he was finally caught, and it's said before his execution, he famously said, "I was born with the very devil inside me." Number 5. Sam Little. Known for being one of the worst serial killers in history, Sam Little has confessed to taking the lives of more than 90 people, and while authorities have only been able to, connect him to 30 officially, they say they have no reason to doubt the other ones are probably true as well. Sam was able to continue this horrible path for so many years because of the fact that he committed these crimes in different states and different countries, which made it, of course, difficult to connect his crimes to one another. He was too fast. He changed his name a lot, and that's obviously hard. In an interview with an investigator named Sergeant LeBlanc, they discussed religious beliefs, and they spoke about the nature of sin. Here comes the devil stuff, You're like, okay, when does it get to the devil stuff? Now. During the interview, of course, Sam stated he had no fear of God and even said that God made him this way, so why should he ask for forgiveness? He said that God knew everything he did, and he also allegedly told a few select people that he believed that he himself was the devil. Number 4. Ronald DeFeo. Moving on to another case that inspired more Hollywood horror. If you've seen the Amityville Horror, in some ways this should ring some sad bells. Although the movie adds a lot of paranormal aspects that was not present in reality. Or was it? No one's really sure. That's the main argument nowadays. Ronald was charged and convicted convicted of taking the lives of his entire family. Last year he passed away in jail at the age of 69. After his passing, certain letters that he had written were released. Before his death, Ronald had given many different accounts of what happened on that fateful night, which has made it now impossible for anyone to follow or really understand how it happened. Ronald himself stated there was no demon. You know who the demon is. It's me. I am the demon. So does this mean he wasn't in fact possessed, or he is at the time? Somebody saying they're a demon certainly doesn't help their case. I don't know. Number 3. David Berkowitz. Also known as the son of Sam, David Berkowitz is a killer who again thinks that he works for the devil. Now this time, the real culprit for the horrible crimes was a demon who had taken the shape of a dog that belonged to his neighbor. That was the said demon that made David do it. He led authorities on one of the largest manhunts ever seen after this in New York, and in true twisted killer fashion, he left notes behind. Yeah, trying to be arrogant, thinking he would never get caught. You know, working at 9 to 5 in the underworld, you'd think there'd be more places to duck out and hide, but David was caught and convicted. He later admitted to making up the dog story, but he did say that instead he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as part of that. Number 2, Arnie Johnston. This one's a little different because this person didn't claim to be from hell, but rather they had hell inside of them when they committed their atrocious crime, and it wasn't their fault. This trial was well known previously, but has become, of course, more widely spread as it's the trial in the newest Conjuring movie. In 1981, Arnie Cheyenne Johnston killed 40-year-old Alan Bono in what appeared to have been just a simple argument gone wrong quickly and got more twisted and confusing. When it came to his defense for the crime, the devil made him do it. Yeah, just like the third installment in the Conjuring franchise, the title, Devil Made Me Do It, is in direct relation. That was his excuse. This was the first time in history now that possession had been used in an American courtroom as defense. Prior to this, Arnie had been at the scene of about 3 exorcisms that had occurred before this, alleged possession, and this is why there's so many people that believe him. At the end of the day, the jury in the trial decided to convict him of manslaughter. And finally, number 1, Niccolo Paganini. We'll finish off this demonic list with the late Italian composer Niccolo Paganini. This man knew how to play the violin, let me tell you that. Apparently a little too well, some would say. The 18th century icon brought romance to violin technique. He studied with many violinists over his life, but what really explains his skill is the fact that his mother made a deal with the devil when the lad was only 6 years old. Niccolo leaned into these accusations and actually used it so people wouldn't mess with him anymore. They would be afraid of the violin composer, They're like, oh, we don't talk to him. He's like the Doctor Strange violin guy. He fights with music. Thinking back now, I'm like, yeah, I get that. Guy needed to invent romance via a violin. But what if he was? What if he was working for the devil the whole time? The musician passed away at age 36 and there wasn't a single church that would take him. It's pretty rude, but also it's understandable. We'll use your music at the funeral, but we're not gonna bury you. Thanks.